I was thinking about just different figures. Some are players, some are coordinators, some are strength coaches. I mean, some may be athletic directors, but the most important figures in the college football world any given year. It's not always just a list of the Heisman candidates and the most elite head coaches. So tonight we're going to talk about Sam Howell a little bit. And that's the concept. How about the hype here? The hype around North Carolina. It's two or threefold. If you're a diehard college football fan, there's hype because, well, you saw how close they came against Clemson last year. You have felt the undercurrent, sort of the groundswell of momentum around this program. You see what they're doing in recruiting. And unlike some teams that have already peaked, North Carolina's doing it with in-state guys. And so it stands to reason they've probably got a lot more staying power with this recruiting class. And that guy, Sam Howell, that's the other kicker. Sam Howell is a guy who is poised to burst onto the national scene this year. He's not a national name yet. He's a guy a lot of college football fans know. But like I said, casual fan from Tulsa, Oklahoma, I don't think that they are really aware of Sam Howell like they are Trevor Lawrence or like they would be Justin Fields. So he's a guy who has the skill set to insert his name into that conversation. I was reading some stuff over with our buddies at Inside Carolina. Grant Hughes had put together sort of a collection of different takes on Carolina, different takes on Sam Howell, and then his own spin, and he put together some really good numbers himself about what that guy's already accomplished. Do you realize he's already sixth all time at North Carolina in passing touchdowns? He was a true freshman last year. That's the only year he's ever played there. He's already in the top 10 in a lot of offensive statistical categories for a career. Pro Football Focus. Second most valuable season from a true freshman since they've kept that stat. Number one is a guy you've probably heard of in the same region. His name is Trevor Lawrence. He still plays football for the Clemson Tigers. Now here is what has everyone excited. What I just mentioned to go along with the fact that North Carolina returns 93% of last year's rushing yards and receiving yards. Now consider, we're talking impact, the most impactful people, the most important people in college football this year. Consider the impact that this guy could have on a multitude of different fronts. It's obvious what he could do for Carolina, but consider sort of the ramifications for other teams. Some are on Carolina's schedule, some maybe not. They start the season at Central Florida. I saw Five Dimes, I believe, release some lines on that the other day. Maybe a 3-point dog, short dog, North Carolina on the road to start the year. Interesting. You guys have complained and complained and complained about not enough folks going into Central Florida to play them. Well, Carolina does this year. They open the season at Central Florida. Now, you and I both know that's a chance to knock one of the perennial G5 playoff contending teams, at least being in the conversation, off in week one. So there's that opportunity. But this game also matters a lot for Carolina. I'm going to circle back to that in a second. You know who they play in week two? They go back on the road, kinda. They go to a neutral site. They play Auburn in Atlanta, speak of the Tigers. So that's week two. And do you understand what happens in Auburn circles if that offense sputters in week two in Atlanta against a non-conference opponent and they don't have that offensive line in gear? And all of the losses that Auburn has started to suffer defensively, they're exploited by one of, as it turns out, the best quarterbacks in America. It could impact Auburn. But now I want you to think about this for a second. After that, it's not that they play high school teams, but they've got a classical ACC schedule. Every game's manageable. They should be favored in a vast majority of those games. They don't play Clemson in the regular season. But it stands to reason, if they make it through all that, Clemson will be waiting there for them in the ACC championship game. So look at what bookends their schedule. Let's just hypothetically for a second, let's paint a path where they make it to the conference championship game. You have played a schedule here that includes Central Florida, a very reputable G5 opponent, probably the most high profile that you could play, and you went on the road to play them. If you've won that game, especially if you've won that one and you've beaten Auburn, one of the SEC big boys in week two, and by the way, you took it upon yourself to schedule both of these out-of-conference games, and you've got Clemson at the end of the year. Do you understand we're talking about paths, realistic paths, for Mack Brown's North Carolina Tar Heels to be a college football playoff contender? A lot of time between now and the beginning of the season, obviously. A lot of time between now and then. They have a path to be a player here. Now, the path's obvious if they go undefeated. Obviously, they're in. What in the world's happened to Clemson at that point would be my question. But Let's paint a different path. I want to ask you something for a second. Think about how absurd it would sound on the surface if I said, hey, I think 2 ACC teams could make the playoff this year. How absurd does that sound? Well, think it through. Now, this takes some help from outside the conference, but think it through. Let's say the path I just painted up to the ACC championship game happens. Carolina didn't schedule down. They didn't put Wofford on the schedule. They didn't open up against Norfolk State. They went to Central Florida. They played Auburn at a neutral site and beat them both. Let's just say they beat them both. And run the table and beat everyone else they're asked to beat, and then they fall competitively to number 1 or number 2 Clemson in the ACC championship game. You're sitting there, ironically, having not played the Clemson Tigers in the regular season and may not have faced but one ranked opponent on your entire conference schedule. But because you have the combination of a very impressive loss in a conference championship setting against a playoff team, 2 very impressive wins against top 20 caliber out of conference competition, and maybe you have a mess in other conferences to where there are not 3 other slam dunk candidates for the playoff. Maybe it's a Big Ten, Clemson, and SEC, and then just a jumbled mess of 1 and 2 loss teams from elsewhere. That could be the second path for them getting in there. And I'm going to just tell you right now, this is not a prediction show, especially tonight in June, but I'm telling you right now, a lot crazier things have happened than that scenario. Everyone thinks right now, and I believe this. Now, I believe Penn State, I said this a couple of weeks ago, Penn State is the most likely non-conference champion to make the playoff this year, to me, because of how the Big Ten sets up. But North Carolina is also in a position, albeit over in the corner, in a dimly lit corner at that, to sit there and have 2 very quality non-conference wins, a competitive loss in a conference championship game on their resume, and if you got 3 more undefeateds, then it's a moot point. But if you enter a situation where we got 3 slam dunks and then that 4th spot, hey, let's just juggle these balls and see which one we have in our hand when the music stops. It could be one that's painted that beautiful light hue of Carolina blue. Just something to think about. Sam Howell is very important this year. I know Mack Brown is. Sam Howell is very important this year because you also got to understand if either of those scenarios realistically were to unfold, it means he's had a monster season, which also means, for those of you who care about the Heisman Trophy, not my cup of tea necessarily, he's in New York City for the Heisman Trophy ceremony as well. A Carolina quarterback. Been a little while since we talked about this program like that. Good to have him back.